Going to get started. Hopefully, council members Parks and Smith will be here shortly. We only have one item on the agenda, so if we could call that item.
Good. City Controller report relative to a review of the Los Angeles Department of Transportation's contract with Integrated Systems Research Corporation to provide an automatic vehicle locator system.
And if we could start with the representatives from the City Controller's office to give us their report.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
Brian Young with the City Controller's office, Special Investigator with the Fraud and Waste Unit. So the Fraud and Waste Unit, we actually conducted this review. This resulted from an anonymous whistleblower complaint that came through our fraud hotline, and basically it was a review which is very similar to an audit. So it was released as a public document, so it's all public record. In 2001, Department of Transportation, they entered into a 5-year lease purchase option contract with Integrated Systems Research Corporation. And the nature of the contract was for a automated vehicle locator system. And I'm going to simplify what that is, but basically the vehicle locator system, it was to install equipment into 625 traffic enforcement vehicles for Department of Transportation. It also included software, and it included computers for base stations. So basically, the way it worked is a vehicle locator system. It had a GPS component where a base station at each of the divisions, they can communicate, they can actually see a vehicle on a screen, so they would know where all of their traffic vehicles were located through the GPS system. In addition to that, there was a transmitter known as MDT. And basically what that was a communication device between a division base station and the actual traffic officer. So the main purpose of that was to have some type of communication that can send text messages. And in addition, there was also a safety aspect to it. One of the provisions for this contract was to include a safety provision under the JLMC 10-point plan. So basically there was an alarm that was on there. If a traffic officer had some type of emergency, he can activate this alarm on the system, and then it would notify the base station and they can take appropriate action. So that's kind of just a simplified version of what the contract was all about.
Let me ask you, as long as I don't mean to interrupt your presentation, but
sure.
Reading the materials I've read, I'm not entirely clear what the great value of this project, even if it were well done from the start, what made it worth millions of dollars to implement. I'm not entirely clear on what value the city was getting out of it.
Okay, I'd have to defer to the department, but I do know that in the initial request, I think in the RFP, it arose, or it was one of the components of a joint labor management committee 10-point plan. So I think the main purpose, again, I have to defer to the department, was to improve efficiency, to ensure officer safety, to have this added benefit for activation of an alarm if a traffic officer was ever in danger. And then it also allowed management to have the capability to actually monitor their drivers when they're out in the field. I do know that in one of the reports, DOT did indicate that they used this to develop response times, that response times were actually decreased as a result of this. We didn't actually see any data to support that, but I do know that that was in one of the contract amendments. So I think DOT could probably explain, the main purpose of entering into the contract better than I can.
Yeah, well, we'll ask that that question as a follow-up later, especially if it was allegedly decreasing these response times, how we'd have 11% of them functioning,
Right.
and yet it would somehow mysteriously decrease response times when there are virtually none of them actually working.
Right. Yeah, well, those are good questions to ask. I guess going into the contract, the way we presented it was kind of a chronology, so hopefully the facts came across well. But in 2004, the contractor, ISRC, they approached the department, and basically they told them that the air service provider was no longer going to be able to provide that service. In addition to that, there was a change in technology. So it's kind of like all the equipment that was installed in all of the 500 to 600 vehicles. It was my understanding that they didn't have anybody to service it any longer. So there was a requirement that they had to take out the existing modems that did the GPS part of it, and they had to reinstall brand new modems. They also had to create software that was compatible with the modems. So that's what they did. The question that we raised in the report was that DOT actually paid for all these new modems. We're still in the lease purchase option phase. We're still within the 5-year range. In addition to that, there was a warranty provision in the contract that said it covered equipment and software. So we were kind of unsure, why DOT had to purchase, this equipment, for $213,000.
And for the record, Mr. Parks has joined us.
So under the 5-year lease purchase contract, which was going to expire in May 2006, the original contract basically said there were 3 options at the end. There was the option to purchase all of the equipment for $1. They could return the equipment back to the contractor, or they can upgrade the equipment. So those were the only 3 options available under the initial contract. DOT actually didn't execute any of those options. They did a 4th option, which was to enter into a month-to-month lease going forward. And that actually went on for an additional 4 years. So, the way I see it is kind of like you have a vehicle that you lease for 5 years. At the end of the 5-year lease term, you can go to the dealer and say, hey, I like this car, I want to buy it. How much does it cost to buy it? Well, that didn't happen. They actually leased the same equipment that they had already purchased through the 5-year lease purchase option. So over the 4-year time period going forward from May 2006 to May 2010, that actually accounted for $577,000 in the lease of the equipment. So that was in addition to what was already paid under the 5-year lease term. So we noted that as a significant waste of taxpayer money. Basically, the way it's set up on the invoice, every time DOT would get a monthly invoice, there's a separate charge for the equipment alone, and there's a separate charge for the actual airtime. The airtime is actually provided by a third-party company, so basically it's like AT&T or somebody else. So it's not even directly provided by ISR. It's a third-party contractor, and they subcontract through ISR. So even though we basically own the equipment at that time, to use it, you still needed to pay for the airtime. So that was fine. We understand that going forward. You still need to pay for airtime. But it was the equipment that was the big issue. DOT actually did their own internal audit looking at the equipment. So this was done prior to our review. They were in the process of actually making a determination as to the status of their equipment. And it was actually their own internal audit that resulted in the 11% that were actually fully functional. Some of the units had partial functionality. Basically, somebody from a base station could see through the GPS part of it. They could actually see where a vehicle was. The problem is that the officer that's in the car, he couldn't communicate with the base station. He couldn't activate his alarm, or he couldn't communicate through the text device. So that was kind of connected from the GPS to the screen that connected to the base stations. So that's where the majority of the non-functional units were identified. We actually went out to 2 different division offices ourselves. We did a random sample. We didn't want to recreate their own work, but we wanted to verify. So we went and looked at 20 vehicles, just randomly selected. And of those 20, only 3 were actually fully functional. So it kind of supported their 11% that were the working units. Another thing that we identified in the report was that there were 178 units that were not being used at all. What would happen over time is that when a vehicle was salvaged, they would take out that unit, and sometimes they would install it in a new car. But I guess there was a decision at some point in time that they were not going to reinstall these into new vehicles. They decided that they didn't have the support for that. So they actually placed 178 units in storage, and we looked at the cost for that 2-year time period for the lease of the equipment and the air costs, and it was $141,000 for equipment that was not being used. The last item that we looked at was we wanted to try and do an inventory of where exactly are all of the 625 units that they purchased. DOT didn't have an inventory, so we had to improvise. And what we did is we looked at the contractor's own internal report. They had a report showing that 403 units actually had a system, had a GPS transmission, and we already knew that 178 units were actually in storage. So that came up with 581. 625 were purchased, so the difference was 44. But again, there was nothing to compare because they didn't actually have an inventory. So that was our finding on the non-accounted for units. So that kind of sums up, our review. Total, we looked at, how much we projected that was actually wasted was about $855,000. And basically that was the lease of the equipment beyond the 5-year lease term. That was the money that was spent to actually purchase new modems and software for $213,000. And then there were the units that were actually in storage, the 178 units. So if you add those 3 together, it comes out to about $855,000.
And we were paying for the airtime of the units in storage as well.
Right, that's correct. And that's incorporated into that figure.
I mean, I looked at the letter from the controller, which notes that this is waste and financially irresponsible decisions that defy comprehension, and I think that is really the case. Now, it's not entirely clear to me whether, when the contract was renewed after the 5 years, whether there was even an analysis of whether the product was providing the services that were intended at the time. But if there was, my understanding, I know we looked at a legislative motion, which I think was actually, with some irony by now Controller Ms. Gruhl, on leasing these after 2006, and there wasn't a CAO's report, and as I recall, there was no mention in this report of the fact that we could buy the system for $1 rather than leasing it. It looked like it was pretty routine, and one would presume DOT came to her and said, hey, we need this relatively routine extension so we could do a little analysis. In reality, the primary reason that, as I read this was extended was so that we could access software that was supposed to be provided, and upgrades and such. Now, that was in 2006. In the ensuing 4 years, the software upgrades were never provided. So, in essence, we paid for a lease to buy something, to lease something we already owned, or would have owned for $1. And yet, I don't know what went on in the ensuing 4 years. One would assume if someone on our staff was doing their job, they would have been saying, where's the software upgrades? You know, why did we pay for this for 4 years and didn't get it? You would assume that someone at the vendor's office would be saying, hey, you leased this so you could get the software upgrades. We have the software upgrades. You know, why are you not implementing them? Somewhere, as far as I see it, there's either two possibilities. People on both ends were totally falling down on their job, and there's no follow-up and just an incredible amount of incompetence on this contract. Or the other possibility, and it's less likely but not impossible, is that somebody somewhere was profiting both at the end of the business end and internally. And this could be a criminal activity, because we paid for something for 4 years that we knew we were supposed to get. Nobody on either side tried to make us get it. So, I mean, I've seen companies where this happens, where somebody might be purchasing things that aren't necessary, and they give a kickback to the purchasing agent, and they sell it to the company. They never use it because they have no use for it. I'd like to think it's less likely, but I think we need to figure out, how did this happen? And then the other follow-up is, what do we do going forward? I know that your office is recommending that we take some appropriate forward actions, like terminating this contract quickly. I wonder if you could walk us through your office's recommendations going forward, but I think we also need to look at the accountability. We can't just say, okay, we fouled this up, let's do it right now. I think we also have to go back and say, how did this happen? Number one, so we don't repeat it, and number two, so we hold everyone else appropriately accountable.
Well, I want to clarify one thing. I don't think we actually requested that they terminate the contract. It was my understanding that we asked them to meet with the contractor to determine if they have a need for this, and if they do have a need, at a minimum, execute the purchase option, because they can own the equipment for $1. But the bigger question is, as DOT, are they going to provide the support? It sounded like it was very labor intensive, and they did not want to provide any support. That's kind of what led to the deterioration. So,
well, one would assume if you make a decision to lease and purchase an expensive system like this, you do it with the assumption that you're going to provide the support. The idea that this would be badly needed, that we'd shell out millions of dollars and then we just let them all rot, have a handful that are working, have the rest in storage, and have no one coming back to us saying, we're wasting a lot of money on this, let's stop. So I'm assuming now that somebody, and presumably this would have gone on for a lot longer had a whistleblower not brought it to our attention, but now that it is at our attention, this either needs to be fully implemented and we need to be shown there really is a need for it, or it needs to be stopped immediately. And frankly, we should be going after the company as well that knew we leased this for software services and knew they never provided it.
Yeah. No, we agree. We did recommend that the department, meet with the contractor, and also we indicated that, the warranty provisions seem pretty clear to us. we still do not understand why they had to purchase equipment that they were leasing. I mean, it's kind of like you're leasing equipment. If somebody tells you your equipment's not going to work anymore, you're still under a lease option. So this was in the middle of the 5-year lease in 2004. They went and they purchased new modems and they purchased the software. So actually, I mean, DOT, they leased the software and they purchased the software. So it's almost like they already paid for it twice. So, I mean, it was installed on DOT computers. It was installed on the base stations. And it was my understanding that you couldn't just turn off the software because it was already installed. It was already there. It was already in place. The airtime is different. I mean, you have to pay for the airtime. You have to pay for a service to operate it. You know, DOT, I mean, we had a number of recommendations in there, so it's kind of the ball's in their court as to, you know, how they're going to rectify this.
Any other questions for the Controller's Office?
Oh, no, I'm interested in DOT.
Well, we are too, so let's ask them some questions next. But if you could stick around, we may have more questions for you as well.
Good afternoon, council members. Amir Sadadi, Assistant General Manager, LA Department of Transportation. I am joined with Deputy Chief Rudy Carrasco of the Bureau of Parking Enforcement. And first and foremost, we want to thank this committee for this opportunity to be before you and be able to respond to your questions. We also want to thank the Controller and Ms. Gruhl for her due diligence on this. And you know, we, as mentioned with our general manager, who unfortunately could not be here today, agree that any avoidable loss of funding to the city is unacceptable and has to be corrected. And I think Mr. Young did a good job of explaining the AVLS system as presented in a, you know, I do have a more in-depth presentation. I wasn't able to get it in time for the clerk, but we're happy to submit this to you so you kind of have an understanding of what the AVLS components are.
And
But
maybe you could give us a 1-minute thumbnail sketch of what we were intended to get out of the system.
And I will, and I actually will, after my little presentation, I'll go ahead and give it to Mr. Carrasco, and he'll give you that 1 minute, and then I think we'll be able to answer some of your questions, Councilmember.
You can even give more than a minute if you want.
Sure. But I think one of the things that was also mentioned by the Controller's report is the fact that, you know, as this concept and contract, they began initiating back in 1999. Since 1999 to present, we've had 6 general manager changes within the Los Angeles Department of Transportation. So as the report stated, a lot of the predecessors and other leadership is not here for us to specifically go back and answer some key questions, but we want to be able to have that opportunity to work with the controller, with our internal staff, with the vendor, to then provide a written response, not only to the controller's office, but as well to this committee, with a lot of the questions that we're going to hear from you today, and also responding to some of those. Under the current leadership, we've at DOT, we have tried to connect a lot of the dots within the operation and administration. We have brought in, and also the controller's report does give some direction for us to work with them and the vendor for some appropriate services under this contract. And, you know, we began some of that discussion even prior to this audit back in March. We've had the vendor out here. We, as Mr. Young mentioned, done our own internal audits, and I'll get to a few of those later. But we are using technology to really improve efficiencies and also the safety of our traffic officers, and that was a key point that Deputy Chief Carrasco will talk to you about the 10-point plan. We obviously don't have a written response for this committee today, but we are started working with the vendor today. We met with the vendor, and the vendor is here today. We'll be here all week, so we began those discussions to not only go back but also to look at some of the key points you brought up, Councilmember Koratz, on future, on the need, on the available options we have, both operationally and financially, because the city obviously is in no state right now to be wasting any kind of money. So we just met with the vendor today. We, as I mentioned, don't have a written response today. We're here to answer any questions that we can, and also take a lot of these questions with us so that we can include them in our responses to this body. Just a few things, and actually I'm going to let Deputy Chief Carrasco give you a little bit of update, and then I'd like to do a few clarifications and key things that you had brought up, and if I can address that, and then we'll answer any questions.
Great.
Good afternoon. In response to your question with regards to what was the intent of utilizing this particular technology, in the original RFP, we identified the fact that through this technology, we could enhance our ability to deliver services to the public. We could reduce vehicle operating cost, increase officer productivity and performance, and enhance the security of our field personnel. In addition to that, we intended to use the system as a backup communication system. Our primary form of communicating with our officers in the field is a two-way radio. We utilize that through our communication center, but we've also had times when we've experienced a breakdown in our communications. So considering that the Avl Mechanism provided an MDT, it allowed us to communicate with all of our officers simultaneously in the event that there was an emergency. This also assisted us in reducing our communications backlog, considering that we, as a bureau, we do not have access to computer-aided dispatching, so therefore we utilize the Avl system to identify the nearest officer. For example, in the event there's a service call or a request to respond to an emergency, we could utilize the Avl system to identify the nearest officer to that location, send a message to that officer, and then have them respond. Now, I tell you, the Avl mechanism itself consists of three pieces. There is an antenna which is mounted on the roof of the vehicle. There is an MDT which is located inside the cab of the vehicle, and then there is a box that we refer to as the silent positioning monitoring box, which is located in the trunk of the vehicle. The system uses a GPS technology to send a signal from the satellite to the antenna to the box to position the vehicle. The position of the vehicle is then plotted in XY coordinates and laid on a map. So we can access that vehicle from a base station terminal. We can enter the vehicle shop number or identifier and locate exactly where that vehicle is in regards to XY coordinates. We utilize that technology, as I said, back when we initiated the contract, we utilized that technology to ensure that we were able to respond to requests for services in a timely manner. In addition to that, we've also used it in investigations. In the event that we had received a complaint regarding one of our officers, we were able to pull up historical data and identify whether or not the officer was actually at that location. We've also utilized the technology to locate vehicles in the event that we were able to recover a stolen city vehicle by locating that vehicle through GPS technology. And those were the primary objectives when we first purchased the system. As the time went by, we identified other uses. For example, we utilized the system to fine-tune our deployment schemes. We've also created electronic boundaries and attached that to the vehicle. An example is if we have an officer that is deployed to a specific geographic area during a specific day of the week, time of day, we can build those parameters into the SPM, dispatch the officer, And if the officer is not at that location during that time of day, day of week, a report is generated. We refer to it as an exception report. That report is generated at the end of the day and then provided to the supervisor the following day. So the supervisor then can have an open discussion with the employee to determine exactly what their activities were and why they did not comply with the direction that was provided to them. So we've expanded the use of this technology to not only as a positioning or to determine where the position of the vehicles are, but we've also used it to raise the accountability of our officers. And in addition to that, we're able to determine whether or not an officer is actively involved in enforcement. For example, if that vehicle is sitting in excess of 30 minutes, we receive an exception report, and we can conduct a follow-up investigation. So there are a number of uses, and the original objective here was to ensure that we not only provided that increase in service, but that we enhance the safety of our officers, and that we maximize the use of this technology to ensure that we can improve efficiencies across the board.
Now, based on what you just said, you would actually think this was a really active part of your operations. If that were the case, how could only 11% be functional and many of them be in boxes and storage?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of pieces to it, council member, and on the surface, I think all of these are excellent questions, and each has really a response that has a domino effect of other things that's occurred. The internal audit we did that was mentioned is true. However, that was an incomplete audit. That was only we only had done 73% response. So out of the 73%, 11% was represented. We were in the process of completing 100% survey of internal audit to get the information. So as soon as, again, in our responses, we'll respond to that and say what the actual number is.
It's not going to save you in terms of being functional.
I understand.
If 73% had 11% in use, something is devastatingly wrong and should have been obvious to everyone involved if there is such a low percentage that are functioning and in use, and yet it was actually a valuable function. How that never came to anyone's broader attention is kind of beyond me.
It was, and I think that's what we need to get into a little bit of how to connect a lot of the dots, because a lot has occurred between 2004 and to date. All of the council reports has a very detailed history, which is represented in the controller. They have all of it. I can just quickly run you through some of the chronological events that occurred. One critical information left out of Mr. Young's testimony was that in 2005, the department did begin an RFP process. So 1 year before the contract was to expire, we as a department, I wasn't here, but the department at the time began an RFP process. As we went through committee, I think Councilmember Parks might remember this, but there was a committee where I think it was transportation. I don't have my notes in front of me, but a committee said that let's look at a citywide AVL and see if there are economies of savings and scales, because sanitation, general services, there was many other departments that were looking at the automatic vehicle locator system. So we then said, let's do a month-to-month, because we're now going to pursue an RFP and a citywide approach. So that kind of began the process, and I'll kind of, again, we'll have all of this for you in writing, and it is actually in the controller's report as well.
And that effort died off. I'm not sure why it never went citywide.
Many reasons. ITA was tasked with that. They looked at it. There's actually a report. There's a council report that explains their reasoning, and they came back and said, DOT, your use is specific in its nature, and it doesn't make sense to mix you up with sanitation and other departments, so you go ahead and do your own operation, your own RFP. And by that time, now it's like mid-2006 or I think early 2007, we looked at, and we had funding in place. And we, at the time, LA Police Department was looking at a full dispatch and centralized dispatching and AVL systems. So we said, why don't we work with LAPD and piggyback possibly on your contract or include us in your contract? That took an extensive time, and when that was done and over, LAPD said, well, no, our system is standalone, and we're not going to be able to let you play with us, or, so there's a lot of factors like that. And then in 2008, the funding was swept. So we actually did an RFP. We actually had 4 vendors respond. We couldn't hold the selection because the funding was swept as the state of the city's economies, and this is a general funded function, so that kind of got swept, and we had no other choice but to continue the existing contracts in order to provide the services. And I like to also talk a little bit about the change.
Why did we at no point stop leasing this and just buy it for the dollar?
That's a great question.
Pay for the airtime that we needed directly rather than going through a third party. My understanding, it was always for the ability to upgrade the software and maintain the software product, and yet my understanding is also we never got any software.
And those are again some interpretations or clarifications that need to be made, Councilmember. And we have the vendor. We just had our first meeting. There's some additional information gathering back and forth to be able to clearly come back with some definitive answers for you. But to put in perspective the change in technology, back in 2004, there was a change in the way the communication technology was provided, and I apologize, I learned this today, but it was a technology called CDPD, Cellular Data Package, where that was a technique of communication being sent back and forth, where AT&T was that provider, and that technology was phased out and was being replaced with what's called GPRS, which is a technology used today via mobile communications. And so there was a change in the type of technology that needed to be replaced, which is the modems. Imagine today's cellular phones, for example, use 3G and Wi-Fi, and imagine now the vendors go and say, okay, now we have this new 5G, and you have to bring in your phones, and we have to change out the chip because it won't communicate the way it used to communicate. We at the time, DOT worked with the city attorney. We tried to find the documentation where we got their advice and sought their advice before we came to council to ask for the change and the monies that needed to replace that. So a lot of that we're still in the gathering phase of getting what we have in order to respond to those specific questions for this committee.
It sounded as if from the controller's materials that the company should have done it for free, and yet we paid for a lot of those changes in the hundreds of thousands of dollar range rather than getting them to cover it.
And again, so we're looking specifically to how the RFP and the actual contract, what was negotiated and what was to be delivered. So again, we're in the process of having a lot of these discussions and be able to come back in the next 30 days with a written response to these specific controller's report, as well as some of the specific questions that you have for the department. So I can't today speak to specifically what there is an interpretation. You're right, there is that perspective from the controller, but we have to do our due diligence and involve our attorney, our city attorney, and find out, here's the contract, here's the RFP, and how could this be interpreted.
And I recognize it's going to take a lot of investigation because you've got a lot of moving parts. You've had a lot of different personnel over the time, and so you have to reconstruct what happened. But for me, the key is, it looks like between 2006 and 2010, we did this lease to be able to get software upgrades primarily. Whatever we were supposed to get over those 4 years, it appears we didn't get any of it. And so on our end, it should have been someone's job to say, hey, we leased this equipment so we could get X, Y, and Z, which we never got. And at the vendor's side, one would presume they should be saying, hey, you did this as a lease instead of the $1 purchase, so you could get X, Y, and Z, and we've never given it to you. So why are you not working with us to implement it? Somebody should have been working to make sure that we got something for our dollar. And it looks like no one on either side was doing that somehow.
Again, based on us meeting this morning with the vendor who is here, our understanding is we have been provided all of the software upgrades. Again, we're going to get a lot more due diligence done before we come back in writing to you, sir. So I understand there's those perceptions or interpretations, and you and the public have every right to question those decisions, and we'll, as much as we can, reconstruct and go back in time and respond. But I think you said it well, that where do we go from here? How do we provide a solution that still provides the safety of our traffic officers, the efficiency that we need, the improved productivity? And the other thing to keep in mind is the technology in 1999 or 2000 was very labor intensive. At the time when that program was developed, DOT had 6 to 7 sergeants specifically stationed at these units, at these base stations. And it was, a very detailed system where they had to enter information, they had to monitor, they had to generate reports, so it was a very full labor intensive. As time went on, 2006 to present, we've lost, I don't have the numbers today, but due to ERIP, attrition, not being able to fill our supervisory classes, we've gone through a myriad of changes there. Not only that, as early as 2008, we were directed by both the mayor and council to concentrate on parking enforcement initiatives and put a lot of our resources into that. As you recall, in budget hearings, we provided that some of the ancillary duties are now those specialized units we had. We moved them into parking enforcement to be able to go out and patrol and write more citations. So that's where we, as the recommendation is, one of their first recommendation is, do you need the AVL? Do you need it? And then that's what and does it have to be the same way that it was? The other question.
That's the big question.
Yes.
Did we ever need it? Do we still need it? Did it ever actually get implemented and provide what it was supposed to? And if we need it, we either need to make sure there's the funding and implement it, or make a clear decision we can't afford it and stop wasting money.
And that's what we're going to present to you as policymakers to make that policy decision. All we could do is provide you what it did, what it does, what the new solution looks like, at what cost, working with the vendor to see what we can manage and negotiate with them as far as what they owe us. And all of that will be presented to you for you to make the decision. Personally, I think we've worked very hard with the joint labor management groups, and this is under the leadership of back then chair of our committee, Councilmember Gould. There was a lot of threat to our traffic officers. There was a lot of violence. There was a lot of activity where, as you mentioned, there was some legislation change that also protected our traffic officers. So this was one way of not only protecting and having enforced security for them, but also enhancing responding to emergencies, responding to fire department, responding to police department. Imagine you have, in the old days, you have to call the valley for the valley person to then send somebody from downtown because there was a fire in the west side. So now it's
but we can't have it both ways. If 11% of the units are functioning, then you might have the need, but it's not being addressed. So you can't do it in such a half-assed way the way we've done it. You either need to fund it and implement it and be on it, or you need to say, all right, it would be nice, but it's not worth it. I mean, it sounds like a valuable function.
It is, sir. And
it sounds like also we're throwing the money into it and getting almost nothing out of it.
Again, unfortunately, I can't speak on some of my predecessors' decisions, but what we want to assure you and the public is this is a very serious matter to the department. We have, no intention of, wasting valuable dollars, and I respectfully disagree with you as far as your two options of this is either corruption or incompetence. It really is neither, sir, and that, we'll be able to at least provide you the factual information, and then if you and this committee wish to still have that opinion, that's fine, but I don't believe either of those is the issue here. If we were wrong
Corruption, I think, is a long shot, although based on the information presented to us, there's nothing that would tell me intuitively that it's not possible. Incompetence, there's almost no way that you can tell me that, we got down to 11% functioning vehicles, and that's not a massive screw up in terms of service delivery, and the amount of money we've spent without getting much out of it. You can't tell me that's great competence on the part of the people that have been involved with this over the years.
There is a lot that the department owns on this, and we act absolutely there's no excuse for units being in storage. There was a reason for it, and the reason was as we as a department were asked by the mayor and the council to reduce our fleets, we did. The equipment was put in storage because we were looking, all along in this parallel path of 06 to 010, there was an attempt to replace through an RFP. We did an RFP. We actually wanted to have a better, easier system for not only the city, but for our officers and everybody else. So, yes, could a better decision been done at the time to say, why are you charging for this that's in storage? Absolutely. I agree with you. We'll take ownership on those and any other areas where we could have done a better job managing and having better oversight. But at the same time, what we would like to present you in this committee is moving forward, is it needed? What does it provide? At what cost? And for the policymakers to make that decision that as a department, as a city, we recommend it or we don't recommend it. We're going to provide a lot of that information to you in writing. We just don't have it here with us today.
Right. Now, I think we want to look at this in two different directions. One is obviously perhaps the most crucial. What do we do now to stop wasting money and start either providing the service or abandoning the service? At the same time, this kind of thing has gone on in various places in the city for I don't know how many years, and they pop up every once in a while. And I think we have to have some accountability. Otherwise, 20 years from now, we're going to still see these kinds of things popping up in every department. And we need to figure out, how do we avoid this kind of thing happening in the future? Because there was a very substantial amount of waste of money. I presume not enough analysis at some of the key points to figure out that we're just spending money on services that we're not getting. So I want us not only to have the answers going forward, I want us to have the answers going backwards as well, to figure out how we got ourselves into this hole, how we wound up paying for things we weren't getting, how we wound up allowing for services that we intended to provide to go into almost total disrepair. Almost none of this makes any sense. So hopefully when you come back, you can put it all into place for us as best you can.
And I think, Councilmember, thank you for that. And we actually have, and one of the responses, actually, you just mentioned it yourself, is the fact that as a city, we don't have central contracting oversight. We don't have, every department does their own RFPs, and every department has their own contractual. So even with the Office of the City Attorney, they only sign to form and legality. So as a big picture, I think it's worthwhile. As you said, many other departments, you've seen these types of oversights or incompetence, however we want to mention it. So I think in our response, that's something for, as a city, you might want to look at is a way that there are centralized contractual, that as a city, we follow those central contract oversights or preparations of RFPs or other things. So
I think that's true. If we can find a way to systematize some of this process, I think clearly that would be a good thing.
Great.
And even in 2006, my understanding is that when this was voted on, there wasn't a CAO report. Even if the CAO had done a little bit of analysis, we might have picked up on some of the things that were happening and avoided them as well.
And if you like us, we can work with the CAO or CLA on our response, but at this point, we're working to bring back information on the controller's report as well as any additional information that this body is requesting us.
Great. And I didn't mean to monopolize all the questions. Mr. Parks, do you have some follow-ups on
I just
this?
have a couple of questions. Maybe you could remind me on the issue when you came with the RFP and the decision was made to look citywide. Was that placing a hold on your initial effort, or was that just
It was,
in the interim?
no, it was did ask, hold off on the RFP and let ITA look at our need as well as the other departments within the city. And that took some time, and before,
In time.
I want to say maybe 8 to 9 months.
Now, did they come back and say they couldn't deal with it, or what?
No, the report came back saying there will not be economies of scale for DOT to do with other departments. So that recommendation was for DOT, go ahead and do your own program.
Okay, then when you restarted it, the RFP went out, and that's when the money was swept?
So at that moment, when we got the information from ITA to do it, we then started looking at a faster track than an RFP, which piggybacking on existing contracts within the city. And that's when we found out that LAPD was in the process of doing a very state-of-the-art dispatching and centralized dispatching and an AVL. So then it took us almost, I want to say, 8 to 9 months working with them. We met with them, and at the time the vendor was IBM or Motorola. I'm not sure who it was. And then that kind of, we've had, and all this is documented, and we have a lot of information. Parallel to that, we looked at cities of San Jose, San Diego, other cities as well, again, to just not waste more time to see, has another city agency within California done it well and they like it, so that, again, we could do a piggyback. And that, again, took almost 8 to 9 months, and we didn't know. Now, monies were there up to, I believe, 2008, and that's when it started getting swept. We had it, we added some more, and then it got swept.
What was the source? You said it was in ITA's budget?
No, DOT's budget.
Yeah, I mean, but I thought you said earlier that ITA, were they the original source?
No, ITA just did the study, I'm not sure which committee, Transportation Committee or one of the committees directed ITA to go do this analysis and then come back with a report.
But then the source of funds was what, general fund?
Was our fund. It was in DOT's fund.
I know, but was it like Prop A, Prop C, or was it
General fund. General fund.
But you said once you got started on the second war round, is that when LAPD got involved? You were looking.
The second round is when we met with LAPD, when we looked at all the other agencies and we determined, you know what, LAPD system is way too expensive and they're not going to allow us the same type of access. So that once that decision was made, and then the parallel path of other agencies within California, we're not going to be able to use their system, that's when we issued an RFP. And we got 4 responses back, and then again, monies were swept. We asked again in our budget, we didn't get it, so that's where we couldn't hold any more selection of the bidders because there was no money.
And so that process was to what, revamp the existing system?
It was to get out of the old labor-intensive, bring it into a web-based system. Councilmember, a lot more bells and whistles with today's technology, because the current system, again, has almost a 10-year technology.
Now, when you went in that direction and they swept the money, was there any discussion, committee or council, about upgrading or allowing this system to continue to function and give it the necessary resources?
We did at the time with, again, at the time was, Councilmember Gruhl was our chair of Transportation Committee. I think in our budget discussions at the time was Ms. Gloria Jeff was the general manager before Rita Robinson. So At the time, we brought that up about the need and necessity and the kind of funding that would be necessary for this program. But as it did not get funded, we didn't have any other option but to extend the contract.
Okay, but when you didn't get funded, that was to bring on a new process. Where was the discussion about, or how did that discussion go as far as upgrading or doing something to maintain the existing program where it was functional until you could go out and go to a web-based?
That happened when we brought the contract extension reports to the Transportation Committee.
Okay, and when that occurred, did that get discussed there and in council?
It got discussed in T committee. It was agendized for council. I don't remember specifically, council member, if there was, specific questions or dialogues on that. But Councilmember Koretz is, I believe the CAO did do a report, sir. I think the CAO did do a report on the contract amendments. Was that your question, that the CAO did not do a report on the contract amendments?
The sort of major approval in 2006,
On that one,
we
okay.
couldn't find any sign of a CAO's report. It just looked like it was just
Okay.
a motion.
But the other ones had the CAO report as far as the contract amendments coming to Transportation Committee and then Council.
And I don't know if the CAO was aware at the time, the state of affairs, that some of these materials were in storage, or that many of the units weren't functional, or if they were just assuming that everything was going along well, and so this continuing the lease made more sense. That's the question, whether anybody was fully aware of anything. Certainly, if the council along the way were aware that they were approving payment for items that were in storage or for vehicles that weren't functional, I'm sure the result would have been different somewhere along the way.
Understand.
But let me go back to the issue, because we really need to find out what was presented to the council committee and the council when you renewed the contract, and what amendments. So that what was the condition of the system? That part of the discussion was, or were we just renewing something because the system was functional? We really need to find out what was the basis of that.
I don't have that. Obviously, it's in the council file. I didn't bring it, sir, but all of that explained the past and explained that, the reason for the extension was because we need the additional time to go get either an RFP or find the fundings necessary to implement a new system.
When they did that, did they also talk about the condition of the current system, the number of...
I don't recall, sir. I don't recall.
We need that when you report back, so you can kind of give us a tracking of what was done. And I think we've talked about this before, I think it's one of those issues that, depending on how issues are presented to committee or council, depends on whether there's a red light that comes on.
Mhm.
And I think it's one thing to say, here's a formality, here's a renewal of a contract, we need the software, as opposed to operationally it's dysfunctional, are things that are brought up in the audit. I think that is really the issue of the separation between the formality of the contract renewal and the amendments, and whether it was ever explored as to the condition of the system. And because if somebody raised their hand and said, the system is non-functional, it would not go hand in hand to approve a several $100 million contract. But the assumption would be, if the department is pushing it forward, that the system is functioning as intended, and we're renewing the contract to continue getting the service. But somebody's got to, because I don't think anyone on any committee is going to jump out of their seat and go inspect a couple hundred cars to see whether it's working. But the assumption is the department's going to give you background, or at least give you the option to make a decision. Because I would think that when we get a contract, the expectation is the department is telling us we're getting our money's worth, and that the department is telling us it's functioning as intended, and we want you to keep spending money. Without the department raising a red flag, it's difficult to believe you're gonna get any more than what's in the report. So that was the things I'd like to see. And another one I'd like to see is operationally, how did it break down as to the condition it's in as of this report? I mean, I can understand, you know, that the money was swept or whatever, those are issues that, you know, those things happen, but how did the operational part of it become dysfunctional?
And frankly, I have some of the amendments here, starting with, I guess, renewal number 4, and it's even a Transportation Committee report signed by the Vice Chair at the time, which was you, and it all looks pretty routine. There's nothing to flag that anything was going wrong. And obviously, if the council tried to check every routine contract and everything personally, we'd have an insanely chaotic city. But there's nothing to give any indication that any of this is going on, that there's anything other than a routine need to renew the contract.
Those are the two things I'd be most interested in. As you track the paperwork, when did the red light come on? And secondly, when did the operation fall apart? And if we knew it fell apart, and it wasn't operating as intended, then what was the department or the commission or whoever going to bring that to our attention?
We'll do that, sir. And again, there will be other information relating to the specific questions of the controller, Councilmember Koretz's questions, and some possible solutions going forward as far as what do we do. Do we terminate tomorrow? Do we, what are some of the things they're going to do short-term and long-term? So all of that will be presented in a report back to you in the next 30 days.
Okay, so why don't we figure a meeting in around the middle of September to discuss all this.
Thank you.
I mean, there are more questions I could ask, but I think clearly you have the general idea, and I think
we'll work
a
with your
detailed
staff
response
if there's anything additional. We'll be happy to work with your staff and get more questions.
That would be great.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we have one speaker from the public on this, Noah Weiss.
Big minute, huh? That's all I get, a minute?
I'll give you 2 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate it. A couple of points, actually, that I want to make. This is a reason why I think we need a public advocate together with a adequate whistleblower protection ordinance. This is just one minor example, particularly if you had a public advocate in every council office. Specifically, because the issue is, as in all of these situations, where's the city attorney in this stuff? Nowhere to be found. If there was somebody within the bowels of the Department of Transportation that was in a position way back when to even blow the whistle, the city attorney, according to the current one, and I'm not going to talk about the past one, the current one would tell you, no, there's nothing I can do. Can't defend, I can't provide any kind of protection for that individual, and I can't really do anything because there's a conflict of interest. This is a loophole and a problem with our system. The fact that somebody calls Wendy Gruhl on the side anonymously, that only gets you so far. This report, as both Councilman Parks' questions and your questions, Mr. Koretz, have pointed out, is incredibly deficient. As far as, Ms. Gruhl herself was chairman of Audits and of this committee, Audits and Efficiency, and also Department of Transportation. The matter was reviewed under her auspices for all these years. Why didn't she, in her own report, account for this kind of stuff? She's got subpoena power, for example. There's nothing. Why don't we have documents from the vendor? Why didn't she go out and get them prior to making her report? Why didn't she go to the DOT prior to her report? Why didn't she evaluate just the normal processes of council and provide a broader means and mechanism by which the council, as a governing body, can better do its job? Mr. Parks is right. You can't go examining, micromanaging this to the nth degree. You do have to rely on the DOT, but the problem is when you start stovepiping this stuff, and you have a city attorney basically who sits by and does nothing because of a conflict of interest situation, there is the gap that needs to be filled. I think that gap can be filled with a public advocate, as well as an adequate and competent whistleblower protection ordinance, and then we can be in a situation to head these things off at the pass and save a lot of money. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have one speaker also under general public comment. That is Noah Weiss.
Okay. Along the same lines, not with regard to this matter, but in general. I just want to plant a seed here. Because I've just had kind of, an unfortunate experience with the city attorney's office relative to a claim that I filed on behalf of, or a lawsuit I prosecuted on behalf of an 83-year-old woman, an inverse condemnation case evolving out of the Moore Park Bridge project. But the bottom line was that the claims procedure in the city attorney's office is incredibly inefficient. The people who are manning, at least in this situation, and I shouldn't be broad-based because I really don't have a basis of saying that, but in the context of my experience, there is, again, what we're talking about is an incredible amount of administrative waste, both in terms of actual time spent as well as opportunity cost, because the time that's wasted on a particular matter is time lost, which can be done in a more productive basis. Specifically, and again, I'm just going to plant the seed here because I've only got a minute and 14 seconds, but these claims procedures, what I'm talking about is, for example, have a situation where you can submit the claims under penalty of perjury. Because this city attorney in particular takes the position, I'm going to save the city a lot of money. And in the end, in this case, he ended up costing the city money because of the improper way that it was handled. But if the claims were submitted under penalty of perjury, that would help the situation. Number two, if you had a mediation component within the protocol, within the city attorney's office, a lot of these things could be filtered through to the point of offering people, again, with proper investigation. And, this city attorney's talking about a bureau of investigation. I don't think that's such a great idea, but we can have a certain amount of internal effort by way of mediation of these claims, and basically hope that they can basically be filtered out. The process in terms of the way that the city attorney handles these claims. Currently, it's just, they'll file the claim, we'll deny it, and we'll force them to go to litigation. That puts the city attorney in a position where they have to defend more than they really should have to defend. That, I think, is inefficient. And in the case of my lady, as I say, an 82-year-old woman, we got the money that we needed to get finally, but I got to tell you, she shouldn't have had to go through it. Thank you. And more to come. To be continued. Thank you.
Thank you. If there's no other items, we are adjourned.
Thank you for the additional time.
Hey, Karen, we've adjourned. Do you want me to stop it here? On the right-hand side.